Hello, everyone. This is for class on November 12th. Let's turn to World War II and the United States involvement. It would, of course, be the United States that would settle the entire war, both in the Pacific and in Europe, and emerge in the end as a global superpower. So let's talk about how that happened. When last we left Britain, the country was quite alone. Having failed to appease Hitler, appeasement was doomed to fail anyway, and then witnessed the invasion of France, it was very clear that the country was cornered and that nobody in Europe was going to stand up to Hitler. Britain was alone, but like we mentioned before, under the extraordinary leadership of Winston Churchill, wartime prime minister. When it was clear that it was not going to submit to German domination, the Battle of Britain began, July through October of 1940. Saturation bombing of many, many targets across England, not just military targets, but also civilian ones. London, Manchester, and large urban centers, for the first time, directly targeted by the German Air Force, really kind of fulfilling exactly what we saw coming back in the days of the Civil War. You'll recall Sherman's march across Georgia and his realization, the way he put it to Lincoln, that the only way to break the will of a nation like this is to attack the civilian population. Now we see it on a grand scale, a devastating scale, and it would turn out to be just as bad as we know for Germany. Well, in response to this, Winston Churchill, as prime minister, oversaw the attempt by the Royal Air Force to defend Britain by sending up fighters, really, really brave pilots to take on these huge German bombers coming into British cities. At one point, Churchill saw the entire Royal Air Force in the air at once because wartime production had dropped so low after World War I. They were completely unprepared for this. But indeed managed to fight off some of the bombers and try to reduce the destruction. Like some of the graffiti on British planes was really intriguing. Not sure what the Polish squadron meant, but yeah, there's Hitler, number 126, all the kills that they had in the air. Britons themselves, though, were able to retreat underground to the trains, to the subways that run very, very deep through London as they heard the explosions overhead. And then, of course, come back outside to find their homes in rubble, digging bodies sometimes out of that rubble. But still, it was Churchill who gave them the will to endure through all of this, and he would make frequent appearances, walking around the rubble, shaking people's hands, hearing their stories, right there with them. England truly was going to be a bulwark against Nazism. But still, what if the United States helped? Everyone wondered. This would really turn the tide. Britain could not hold on like this forever. Churchill knew it. It was only a matter of time. He went to the United States. He'd been there a few times through the 1930s to try to establish as good a relationship diplomatically as he could with Franklin Roosevelt, knowing full well that there was tremendous opposition to U.S. involvement over there. Isolationism was the rule. Huge organizations formed, the America First Committee and many others. We were not going to get involved in Europe's trouble again. We did that in World War I. There was no reason for us to be over there. This is Fortress Americana was the claim, right? Yet, Roosevelt knew full well that the United States had to do what they could to help Britain, and he found a way through what was called an executive agreement, right? Which isn't exactly a treaty. Treaties have to be ratified by the Senate. The Senate didn't ratify this. He just worked out a deal with Churchill. And what was it? It was the Lend-Lease Agreement. It would later be passed as a law by Congress, but for a few months there, it was entirely just an agreement that depended on these two. How would it work? The United States would send all kinds of aid to Britain in terms of food and supplies and medicine, as well as weapons, in exchange for Caribbean military bases that Britain still had, because it's still the dominant world empire at this time, Britain is. That way, it would appear to Germany as if not the US is aiding Britain, their enemies, but just working out a deal for its own interests. And so the food aid came pouring in from the United States. Little British kids eating, eggs or whatever from Uncle Sam, right? Drawn behind them. How much went over there over time, the Lend-Lease Agreement? And of course, what was the biggest item that the United States sent? It was old World War I battleships sitting rusting in the harbor. Yeah, that's how downsized the British Navy had been in terms of warships. Lots and lots of this aid went to the United Kingdom. But part of the agreement was also that it would go to Russia to help them, as well as the Middle East and Africa. And again, all in exchange for something else, right? So that way it wasn't like the United States is propping up Britain or anything like that. Well, the America First Committee could see right through this. Charles Lindbergh, you remember him? The guy who flew across the Atlantic in 1927 and became this huge celebrity as an aviator, headed up the America First Committee and the Save Our Sons campaign, as it was called, right? The name says it all. I had you read Lindbergh's speech, and we'll come back to this when we talk about essay or talk about debate three on exactly this question. What degree of involvement should the United States have in world affairs? Are we the world's police? Or should we kind of mind our own business and let the world solve its own problems? So it was with the America First Committee. They remember that term was very popular back in the days of in the 1920s. That had actually been the campaign slogan of Warren G. Harding. We mind our own business. We don't get involved in the world's trouble, right? Same idea here. Realizing that, is it even realistic for us to get involved? Europe is vast. The German army is great. So much better to trust in our own isolation, two huge oceans on either side of us, friends to the north and the south, Canada and Mexico. Yeah, no reason at all to get involved. This is Europe's problem, and Europe will have to find its own solution. For us to throw ourselves into this mess is absolutely reckless, and it is driven by people with nefarious motives that want to make a profit. Munitions manufacturers don't do it. So yeah, Lindbergh really persuaded a lot of people, and he seemed quite clear-eyed about the situation. And is the very same position we were in before World War I, and then we fell into it and regretted it later. Let's focus on ourselves first. So, political cartoon captures the spirit of that, right? There's Uncle Sam sitting around his walled nation, right? With all of his planes and tanks and everything, ready to defend himself if he is attacked. The term was Fortress Americana, right? But otherwise unconcerned about the situation over there. Well, other critics saw things quite differently. One cartoonist in particular put it this way. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But hey, they were foreign children, so who cares? As she reads, Adolf the Wolf. Right? You might recognize this cartooning style. Who is it? You guessed it. Dr. Seuss of Cat in the Hat fame. In fact, a book came out recently, a collection of all of his wartime cartoons, and they were really something. He had tremendous moral clarity about this situation, plus a realization that the United States responsibility is just given to us. We cannot be isolationists. We have a duty to the world. And so he captured it quite well in his cartoons, and he was immensely critical of people like Lindbergh. There he is, patting the Nazi dragon on the head. "'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." And that's an actual quote from Lindbergh. What nonsense, said Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss's studio was right there in San Diego, California, my hometown, and also the hub of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor had been attacked. All the ships coming and going and defending the United States from Imperial Japan were right out of San Diego. So, yeah, as he drew these cartoons, he could see Coronado Island and the whole Navy base there. So, Franklin Roosevelt did something absolutely unprecedented. Other presidents had tried to run for a third term and lost. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt also did, and a few back in the 19th century, but Roosevelt did it. 1940. This is unheard of. A president running for a third term, and as we know, he'll run for a fourth term and win. The reason was very clear. The New Deal was long over. The Great Depression was over. Wartime economy, even with the United States not in the war, just preparing for war, boosted the economy dramatically. Unemployment went way down. GDP went way up. But the steadiness of Roosevelt through that era really made him the leading candidate for the coming war. You just don't want to change horses right in the middle of the race, as it was often said. That's the way the American founders understood it too, that presidents should be reelected again and again if they are good presidents, especially if there's a moment of crisis like this. Notice what's happened though on the electoral map. Remember back in 1936, Alf Landon, his opponent, only won Vermont and Maine. Now, Wendell Willkie, his opponent, won not just that, but a huge swath of the Midwest. People were turning against the New Deal finally. This was not the landslide it had been before. But nonetheless, he was president. And weeks into this third term, despite his efforts to help Britain as best they could, best we could, and keep the United States out, after repeated fireside chats promising that we will only be the arsenal of democracy, as he put it, and not directly involved, well, we found ourselves directly involved. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, wave upon wave of Japanese dive bombers, fighter planes that also had bombs attached to the bottom they could drop like a torpedo and hit U.S. ships, attacked the Navy base there in Pearl Harbor and sank several destroyers. And many people on the base were caught so off guard they thought it was a drill until they saw the explosions. Whoa, that's not a drill. Managed to return fire, but more waves of planes came and more and more. Fortunately, many of the aircraft carriers were out in the ocean practicing maneuvers. Had they been there, a much larger chunk of the American Pacific Fleet would have been wiped out. It was sheer luck that they were not. Well, where is isolationism now? What do you think, Charles Lindbergh? He made no comment. The America First Committee just kind of disappeared, and public opinion went dramatically in favor of war. I mean, you've never seen an about face in public opinion quite like this. The following day, Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress to give his address on what happened to the Congress and to the people, and to ask for a declaration of war, the fifth and final declaration of war in our history. Of course, there will be later wars, as we'll see, but none of those were formally declared. This is the last one against Japan, Germany, and Italy, the Axis powers at the time. The speech had that classic line, though, where he said, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in, the original draft said, world history. As he was riding down Pennsylvania Avenue to give this speech, he scratched that out with a pencil and changed it to a day that will live in infamy. Perfect turn of phrase. And so with that, he requested the declaration of war. Congress voted swiftly and gave it to him. And Roosevelt stood at the full power of a wartime president, bringing us directly involved into World War II. Winston Churchill weighed in on this, and he had a very interesting observation. The Americans can always be trusted to do the right thing. In the end, once all other possibilities have been exhausted, makes you wonder, why don't we do the right thing at the beginning? Well, funny thing about us, we just don't roll that way, do we? We like to put problems off. We like to sit there and hope they'll go away. We like to tell ourselves it's not actually a problem, but it is. We prefer to wait, though, until the problem turns into a monster we can't defeat, and then deal with it. But nonetheless, we deal with it very well. And so we did as we transitioned to a wartime economy. Right away, the Army activated the selective service, the draft, remember, and realized within a couple of days that was completely unnecessary. No need for the draft because enlistments exploded. Thousands and thousands of young men and a lot of women across the country stood in line to join the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps and the Air Force. Mostly the Army and the Navy were the two major hubs. Sorry, the Army and Marine Corps were the two major hubs, as we'll see in the war. The Marines assigned to the Pacific, and the Army assigned to Europe. The excitement over serving your country was tremendous, though it wasn't quite the same thing as previous wars. Sorry. Wasn't the same thing as previous wars where it was just sort of a, giddy excitement over being part of history and all that kind of stuff. Instead, it was more the sense of the righteous cause over what had been done to us and what we needed to do for the rest of the world. Very different attitude. Unlike World War I, there was no anti-war movement, as far as anybody knew. There was just this firm sense of duty. The common phrase that you would have heard then was, everybody do your part. Got to do your part. Everybody has to do your part. And so the wartime culture takes hold, and the wartime economy dramatically transforms the United States, especially as munitions manufacturers, private companies like Convair and General Dynamics, get big, big government contracts to mass produce airplanes and tanks and guns and bombs. Everybody's back to work. Unemployment is practically zero through this era. You see wartime production just spike up and up and up. First there is 1941, there's Pearl Harbor, it jumps up, and then it stays high. It goes higher than that all the way through 1933, 43, 1944, and then it tapers off toward the end. An amazing graph, though. Aircraft, ships, ammunition, all the way down, all the things produced. This produced a whole new class of tycoons, as McClay mentions, right? Henry J. Kaiser in particular. And the Kaiser shipyards up and down the coast of California were especially efficient. It was like, Ford Motor Company style production on the assembly line. They could churn out ships upon ships upon ships, um, rapidly produced and yet of the highest quality, capable of, fighting sea battles. You might recognize that name, by the way, if you're from California. Once the war was over, Kaiser got interested in HMOs and hospitals and insurance. Hence, Kaiser Permanente. That's the same guy, but that's later. But for now, yeah, wartime production is so, so high, and it really pulls the country out of the Depression once and for all. And Depression is officially over. Wartime culture is really something. The films produced out of Hollywood. There had been films produced in World War I, but they were all sponsored by the federal government. These were not. These were completely voluntary, and they turned into some great American classics. Gary Cooper as Sergeant York, in particular, set in World War I. True story about Sergeant York, the pacifist who nonetheless discerns the right thing to do and picks up the gun and fights valiantly and wins a Medal of Honor. Ernie Pyle's Story of G.I. Joe. Ernie Pyle was a great war correspondent at the time. Was embedded with the troops and had these magnificent stories to tell that were turned into war stories. Thunderbirds, right, about fighter pilots. All of these designed to inspire a sense of patriotic devotion to the cause of the war. Just nobody ever seems to doubt the righteousness of our cause here. And it really became the stuff of Hollywood production. You saw even animation studios get in on the action. Warner Brothers Studios, right, of Bugs Bunny fame, had the Ductators in 1942, Hitler and Mussolini as ducks, right? Walt Disney Studios had Donald Duck go to war. And the privately produced Private Snafu. They are wildly inappropriate, right? Cartoons. Private Snafu is really, really seedy and out there. And yet, the whole point of Private Snafu was to educate the troops on things they needed to know. Those are the kind of films you'd show, at a camp somewhere, or somewhere a bunch of troops camped out in Southeast Asia, and it would get them laughing, and at the same time teach them things about, not writing home to your girlfriend about where you're going to move next, because the mail could be intercepted by the enemy, stuff like that. So every single front of culture involved with this. And the music. The Andrews Sisters. Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anybody Else But Me was their famous hit. Yeah, as well as the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. And they do these big live performances in front of troops to boost morale, and they were quite good at it. Kind of silly, but if you really want to rock and roll, it's all about the Glenn Miller Orchestra and the swing bands, that pounding drum rhythm and the swing tempo that you danced to, right? This was the era of the big bands that really, really took off. Now, as we'll see, once the war was over, a lot of these musicians went off on their own, and instead of the old-time swing bands, turned instead to the bebop scene of trios and quartets. We'll talk about jazz of the 1950s later. What did this do for American society, though? What did it do for women? Well, if all the men are off to war, the husbands and boyfriends, right? and the munitions plants are hiring, and the women have got the energy for it, you have Rosie the Riveter, as she was called. Many, many, many of the planes and tanks and guns produced were made by American women working these long hours in munitions plants. But again, kind of seeing their role as playing a very important part and putting aside their sort of stay-at-home feminine style of that era and picking up the riveter, right? Picking up the tools. There's a Norman Rockwell's famous Saturday Evening Post cover of Rosie taking a break and eating her sandwich, right? With her riveter across her lap. Yeah. What did this do for women and American perceptions of femininity at this time? These aren't the 1920s flappers anymore, are they? At the same time, they're not the stay-at-home housewife. They're women working, working in industrial jobs, which they had never done before. What would this do to feminism in the coming years? We shall see. What did World War II mean for blacks? Quite a few enlisted, quite a lot enlisted. They would serve in segregated units, of course, whether it was naval pilots, whether it was Army units. The Army is still segregated at this time, but they would serve with distinction and honor and a great sense of pride in serving their country. Some were quite famous, in fact. Joe Louis, the heavyweight boxer, enlisted in the Army, and so too did Jackie Robinson, the baseball player. And you wonder why? I mean, there was still some pretty heavy-handed Jim Crow segregation in much of the country at this time, not just the South, but other places too. The racist feelings, the race riots that occurred through the 1920s and sometimes through the 30s. Well, Joe Louis had a good answer to that question when a journalist famously asked him, why would you enlist and fight for a country that's treated blacks so badly for so long? And his response was wonderful. Lots of things wrong with America, but Hitler ain't gonna fix any of them. Nothing wrong with America that Hitler can fix, Joe Louis said. Exactly. For all of our shortfalls, we still have a creed that guides us. We fall short of that creed all the time, which is exactly what happened with slavery years and years ago, exactly what happened with Jim Crow segregation now. And yet, we know we have a conscience that's higher than that. We know better than that. We know better than what we are, and we aspire to that. Hence, Joe Louis enlisted in the U.S. Army and served his country. Native Americans, treaty after treaty broken, displaced from their ancestral land, and yet they too would enlist in large numbers. The most famous ones were the Navajo code talkers. The Navajo language is well known by linguists for being the most wildly complicated language in the world. It has like way, way more verb tenses and all kinds of strange adjectives and all kinds of features to it that are really unusual. It's just there's no other language quite like it. As a result, Navajo members of that tribe they would join the Marine Corps and they would organize a network of communication using their language that nobody else could understand. Certainly not the Japanese. And so one Navajo code talker could communicate with some other Marine Corps unit on some faraway island on a regular radio signal, and the Japanese would intercept it and have no idea what they were saying. The code was never cracked, and this turned out to be quite essential for Marine Corps communication across the Pacific, thanks to the Navajo. Again, why? Why would they serve their country in this capacity, given the way they had been treated? Because again, they seemed to understand something about America, that it was better than it said it was. It was better than it was in practice. It rose above all of that. Well, what about Japanese Americans? We talked about Chinese immigration back in the day, but Japanese immigration came alongside Chinese immigration. The Japanese, very much like Germans in the 19th century, tended to be kind of the preferred immigrants. They were industrious, they adopted American morals, they minded their business, and yet, as soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked, that sentiment dramatically shifted, especially on the West Coast. Part of it was racism, part of it was just, anger and vengeance toward Japanese people, but there was a real concern about the possibility of sabotage. What if there was a similar attack to what happened in Pearl Harbor, but in San Diego or San Francisco, or oil reserves, lots of big ones on the West Coast? Well, finally, it happened that John DeWitt, Lieutenant General John DeWitt, in charge of the Army's Western Command, testified before Congress and then spoke with the president. He said, I just don't think we can trust persons of Japanese ancestry. Even if they're second, third generation Americans, they're still very, very devoted to their country. They still have a unique ethno-nationalist identity. That's what Imperial Japan's all about. I don't want any of them, meaning persons of Japanese ancestry, here, he said. They're a dangerous element. There's no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he's still Japanese, and that's that. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty, but we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map. What does that mean? Harsh language. And he's kind of referring a lot to his own personal racial feelings. Nonetheless, he had a point. How do we know how loyal these people are? I mean, it only takes a handful to turn saboteurs and, blow up railways or blow up a landing strip for something for airplanes to do something that would help out Imperial Japan invade California. Then what? So the order was given by President Franklin Roosevelt, Executive Order 9066. He really regretted doing this because he understood what a horrible violation of civil liberties this was. But the order was given, and Japanese Americans were rounded up by the thousands and put into internment camps, as they were called, up and down the West Coast. Families pulled out of their homes, out of their businesses shut down, right? Often to, cheering crowds of white Americans and relocated to these camps. Some of them in pretty remote locations, Mojave Desert, Manzanar on the eastern side of the Sierra Mountains. Having grown up in California, I've seen Manzanar several times. There's an interesting museum there. Manzanar was the big one, but there were several others scattered throughout the West in an effort to try to distribute the population, to keep them from organizing, to keep them from getting out. And yet, just like American blacks, just like Native Americans, or the Navajo in particular, they too were given the option of serving in their own way, and they did. The U.S. Army's 442nd Regimental Combat Team was allowed to serve in Europe. 4,000 Japanese Americans, though they had been put in the internment camps, and their families were still there, deprived of their most basic rights, still served their country in Europe and served valiantly. This regiment won 21 medals of honor. They served for a while in Italy, the Italian campaign that we'll get to, and then later in Germany itself. What a story. Well, what happened with the dictators? Benito Mussolini, right in 1943, as the U.S. would invade Italy, was arrested. I thought he was a dictator. Well, turns out the king of Italy still had some royal authority, and he gave the order to simply arrest Benito Mussolini and put him in jail. And he was swiftly broken out of jail by Germans. And he would live in hiding for some time. Well, we'll see what finally happens to Mussolini. But the dictator is overthrown. It seems as if time is running out, and this absolute certainty that Mussolini had, right, that totalitarianism was the future, is suddenly now more and more in question, as Americans landed in the Italian campaign under the command of General Mark Clark. 619,000 American troops invaded Italy, amphibious landings around Sicily and several other parts, and they started moving in, pushing the Italian and especially the German army out of the peninsula. Long, drawn-out campaign, but it wasn't so much because of the numbers of the extended fighting. It was just because the Germans didn't really care too much about Italy, in contrast with Russia, as we'll see. Oops, sorry, skip that. But the landing at Anzio was really impressive. For the first time, we saw what American military technology had become as these massive amphibious ships pull right up on the beaches. The hull opens in the front. Normally, boats could come out for an amphibious landing, but instead they just pulled right up on the beach and the tanks came rolling out. And hundreds and hundreds of American troops all up and down the Italian coast. The capture of Sicily went first. I love this picture of the old peasant helping the army guy. Yeah, get these Germans out of here, he says. Yes, sir. So Sicily was captured, and American troops moved their way forward, only to discover that Monte Cassino, the monastery, of the Benedictine order, founded by Saint Benedict himself, remember, was completely destroyed. Germans just blew it up with cannon fire, didn't want it to be a strategic location that the Allies could capture. It was reconstructed later, but still, wow, the destruction. Finally, the Americans close in on Rome, and Rome is captured June 4th of 1943, and it's done. The air campaign moved forward. No longer was the German Luftwaffe hitting Britain over and over and over again. With the Americans on their side and the B-29 bomber in use, 45,000 of these bombers in Europe, just hitting major targets every day, the Germans simply lost the ability to keep their planes in the air. They lost the advantage and the momentum shifted. And sure enough, like we said, it was not just military targets that were hit anymore. It was high explosives aimed at German cities and German positions in other places around Europe, as you can see. Well, why did things turn so bad for Germany? It seemed like they had the upper hand for so long, and then Hitler made one absolutely bizarre decision. Despite his pact of steel with Joseph Stalin, his promise that he would work with Stalin in holding Eastern Europe, suddenly the German blitzkrieg turned its fury east. They'd already had Poland, remember, and then it just kept going under Operation Barbarossa by June of 1941. Hitler was going to seize Russia. Of course, Russia has a vast interior. It just goes on and on and on of plains and forests. It's a very rugged, remote part of the world. But it was necessary, it was thought in German and Nazi ideology to do this, to give these, superior German Aryan types places to grow, places to expand. And so subordinate the inferior races of the Slavic people. Well, according to legend, Joseph Stalin found out about this and he had a nervous breakdown. He had trusted Hitler, right? And yet Hitler kind of outsmarted him as dictators can, and he never expected it. And he just completely checked out for several weeks. Well, the generals of the Red Army had to figure out how to fight off an invasion of Nazi Germany. The worst atrocities of the war were often committed right here. German troops would surround villages and just massacre hundreds of people, burn down the houses, and of course, as always, rounding up the Jews. Of course, some of the German high command was a bit baffled by this. Their units would fight these brutal battles against the Red Army and seize a village here and there, and within minutes, the SS would show up and say, "Where are the Jews? Where are the Jews?" The Jews? Who cares about the Jews, right? We just took heavy casualties. Indeed, the German army started to really have some doubts about Hitler and the Nazis. They had seized power, and of course, many members of the army were devout Nazis, but a lot of them weren't. They were doing this for Germany, not for him, only to find out that Hitler was the bigger priority here. What gives? Well, the enthusiasm, it seems, started to plummet, as we'll see, especially as winter set in. Right? It was thought that everything would be captured by that fall. Well, sure enough, the Red Army put up a tougher fight than anyone expected. German tanks did not do well in the heavy snow. Germans did not do well with the cold. German winters can be pretty cold, but nothing like the Russian plains and the forests. Of course, the Russians were more acclimated to it. Indeed, morale really, really started to tank. 34.5 million Russian troops faced them off and held off Germans in several positions. The Eastern Front was a monstrous, monstrous place to fight this war. Add to that the siege of Stalingrad and Leningrad that lasted for days and days, and the Germans did finally take the city, but not without taking devastating losses. Well, Stalin could certainly make his point by claiming that Russia was bearing the brunt of this war more than the Americans and the British were. And so they met in Tehran of Iran, November 28th of 1943, to talk about the grand strategy for how the war would conclude. The Big Three, they were called: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And as the conference unfolded, it was agreed that the Western Allies would carry their part of the burden, so it wouldn't just be Russia, by invading Western Europe. Operation Overlord, it was called, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, hear more from him later, as well as General Montgomery of the British Army. A plan was formulated where a joint Allied attack between the British and the Americans, as well as Belgians and French living in exile at the time, small units, would seize the beach in Normandy. That would mean that amphibious assault would seize the beach where Germans were very well entrenched, as well as the paratroopers, who would jump out of airplanes on the other side and pinch the German position between the coast and the inland. It was the biggest, most daring military operation probably in all of world history. You've never seen an amphibious assault like this before or since. And so the operation moved forward. June 4th of 1944, D-Day, it was called. Dwight Eisenhower met with the paratroopers, and there they are, their faces painted, the camouflage, the netting on their helmets, and they're just going to be dropped out of airplanes in enemy territory. What would this be like? The images of the paratroopers is really striking. Stoic faces, just got a job to do. Yeah, I could die. I could die before I even jump out of the plane, but somebody has to do it. Somebody has to do it. And so the planes took off. And these young men who were just duty bound to put themselves in such extraordinary danger jumped out of the planes. Well, taking heavy fire from the Germans, of course, the planes flew off course. They couldn't land them in groups like they meant to, so the units could collect. And so, as a result, the sticks, as they were called, look up in the sky and see all those parachutes. They look like sticks coming down, in the rows that they would jump out of the planes. The sticks were scattered all across Normandy and other places. Several planes shot down full of troops and hit the ground. They never even saw combat. They were killed instantly. But eventually did regroup and started to move toward the coast to meet the Rangers as they tried to seize the beach. This was particularly grueling aspect of D-Day. Those big metal things stuck out in the ocean were there because if the tide was high, the boats could get past them and land the troops closer. The tide was low, right? Those big metal things could hold, because they'd have more beach to cross. And that was the goal, to not let the Americans get close enough because the Germans had entrenched machine gun nests and they could launch mortars and hit them with heavy, heavy fire from up the beach. And yet the Rangers did it anyway. Wave upon wave of amphibious ships. The first ones to arrive were just blown to bits. They never even saw combat. But then the next ones came, and the next ones came, and the next ones came. And then, of course, those bigger ships, finally, once the beach was secure, could pull up and unload the big tanks and the heavy artillery and a variety of other things, and the beach was finally seized. But not without taking devastating, devastating losses. Eyewitnesses claimed by the time it was over and the German position was seized and the beach was secure, the whole ocean was red with blood. Waves of blood washing up on the beach and bodies all the way up and down. Dwight Eisenhower had serious doubts about his ability to do this. And in fact, he carried a memo in his pocket that said, "Our landings in this area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available, and the troops and the air and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. And if any blame or fault attaches to the attempts, it is mine." But of course, he never had to read that memo, because D-Day was a success. Had it not been, though, the whole course of world history, what would it have been? Eisenhower, as we know, would go down in history as quite the war hero and go on to become a future president of the United States, which we'll turn to next week. But wow, what a memo. Reminds you of Lincoln's memo when he thought he was going to lose the election of 1864 to McClellan, and yet it didn't happen, right? Big what if of history. And so with that, the Allies, the Americans, and the British press inland and press inland and press inland. And the supply chain comes more and more and more tanks and weapons and food, and the morale of the troops is quite a bit higher, than it was for the Germans as they were pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. It was grueling warfare. There are hedgerows out there, right? You can't really see across the landscape because of the hedges that separate old farm plots. And so, but nonetheless, Americans moved forward and swung east toward Paris and finally did it, liberating one town after another. And then it happened on August 14th of 1944. 73,000 American troops marched through Paris and liberated the city and liberated the country. What an image! That huge crowd of American GIs. All these guys who only enlisted, right, just a couple years ago, and now here they are, just liberating the country. Charles de Gaulle, French president living in exile in Britain, was there with his own troops, and so reinstalled, and the French government is restored. The French, what was it about Americans? We saw them in World War I, and they did what they did best, right? Charming the locals. Look at this guy's face; it's hilarious. And yeah, the liberation of France, widely celebrated, as this moment of the very, very best of the Americans. U.S. Army Jeep parked in front of the Eiffel Tower. Well, the French resistance had been around for quite some time, highly organized, and they would attack terrorist hits, high-ranking Nazi officials sitting in front of cafes, right? Lots and lots of women involved too in the French resistance. Well, as Paris was liberated, they just came out from every direction. And many, many Nazis, including some high-ranking ones, rounded up and caught as the Allies moved in closer and closer. The agreement was, at the Tehran Conference, that the Americans would meet the Russians in Berlin, meaning nobody would get to Berlin first. It would be calculated, one region after another, and they would divide Berlin evenly. Well, there was another general. It was, of course, George Patton, who had a whole different idea. And he insisted to Eisenhower, look, we can't stick to this plan, because if we let the Soviet government continue, if we let Stalin stay in power, if we don't depose him now, he's going to be our next problem. Sorry, Patton, said Eisenhower, but Stalin's an ally. We can't do that. We have to abide by the agreement. It's the president's decision. I know, but the president is all by the book. So much better to try to have the foresight and to keep our army moving, put us inside Berlin fast, like within a week. The Third Army can do it, he insisted. And then we move on to Prague and move on to Moscow, and we end the Soviet regime. But nope, he was not allowed. Patton was a very strange guy. He believed that he was the reincarnation of Hannibal Hamilcar, who invaded Rome. And according to legend, he'd be, riding along in his Jeep, and he'd tell the driver, stop, stop. And he'd pull over and look over this field somewhere, and he goes, this is where it happened. This was where I fought the Romans centuries ago. He believed in reincarnation. He believed that he was, various historical figures reborn, Hannibal Hamilcar among them. Weird, eccentric guy. But it was effective in the way that he could convince people of just how crazy he was. And indeed, once the war was over, it turns out that many members of the German high command knew full well, right, that he was nuts, and they feared him a whole lot more than they feared Eisenhower or Montgomery. It's the crazy general you should be worried about. But still, like I said, he was the one who insisted and even said to his Third Army speech, yeah, we want to go home. We want this war over with. The quickest way to get it over with is to go get the bastards that started it. The quicker they are whipped, the quicker we can go home. The shortest way home is through Berlin and Tokyo. And when we get to Berlin, I am personally going to shoot the paper hang. Yeah, the paper hanging guy, Hitler. He means. I don't know what he means by paper hanging, but just like I'd like to shoot a snake. But notice the quickness, the speed of his perception of war. War should not be about long, drawn-out, bloody slaughter. War should be about strategy aimed at victory. Isn't that the goal? But that was not the way it was done, and he had to abide by Eisenhower's orders and Eisenhower's plan. And inevitably, what that meant was the Battle of the Bulge. What happened? Germany was well prepared for this situation, being pushed out of France. And so, because of the use of the Autobahn, the vast highways crisscrossing Germany, they were able to regroup and rearm and once again do a second blitzkrieg into France, this time surpassing the Americans. And at that point, it became very clear that the war was not going to be over by Christmas as everyone was anticipating. It stretched on into the winter, fighting Germans again over the very same territory that the Allies had already seized. When we come back, let's turn to the final part of the World War II chapter, chapter 18, and talk about the conclusion of the war. Turn to the Pacific. What was the Pacific theater like? What were the major battles there? Midway, Okinawa, and then, of course, the conclusion of the war. Victory in Europe Day as the Nazi regime is finally overthrown, and, of course, the use of atomic weapons. The death of Roosevelt and the passing on of the presidency to his vice president, Harry Truman. So we'll turn to that next time.